Hi everyone, welcome to episode 23 of Engaging the Eagle, exploring US foreign policy in Southeast Asia. We're a podcast produced by the US program at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, or RSIS. I'm Kevin, an Associate Research Fellow at USP.
Hi, this is Adrian, Research Fellow and Coordinator of US Program.
And we'll be your host for this episode on US-Indonesia ties under Trump 2.0, Part 2. If you haven't already listened to Part 1, here's a quick primer. Indonesian President Prabowo Subianto was one of the first foreign leaders to publicly congratulate Donald Trump on his electoral victory in November 2024. There are hopes that the two leaders might build a close personal relationship, yet there are also sources of friction and challenges. For this episode, we're going to dive a bit deeper into the security aspect of the relationship. Our guest for this episode is Dr. Evan Laksmana, Shangri-La Dialogue Senior Fellow for Southeast Asian Security and Defense, and editor of the Asia-Pacific Regional Security Assessment at the International Institute of Strategic Studies, or IISS. Thank you for joining us today, Evan.
Thanks for having me.
Just off the bat, I think we can ask the same question that we started the last episode with. How would you characterize the current state of ties between the US and Indonesia?
For me, I think right now for both Washington and Jakarta, despite the public pronouncements, I would say the overarching theme is basically managing mediocrity, because that's what it is. The relationship right now between US and Indonesia is mediocre. It's mediocre in a couple of ways. I think when it comes to Indonesia within a Southeast Asian comparative perspective, certainly I think Indonesia is right in the middle of the pack, because when it comes to security engagement, clearly countries like Singapore and Philippines are perhaps much higher in that rank, but certainly I think Indonesia is a higher rank compared to countries like Cambodia or Laos, and definitely not Myanmar. So in that sense, I would put Indonesia right in the middle. The defense engagement, I think, is very much still with regards to personnel, exercises, education, and training. It hasn't really reached the point of major joint exercises in the scale that the Philippines would have, or in terms of defense industrial collaboration and training the way that Singapore would have. So even on the scale or spectrum of defense cooperation, presumably the key point or the key strong point of US-Indonesia relations, Indonesia is still mediocre. And when it comes to broader aspects of the economy, education, people-to-people ties, when you look at around the region, Indonesia also certainly ranks quite in the middle after US alliances, Japan, Australia, South Korea, and the Philippines, and certainly much higher than CMLP countries. So what I feel is that despite the language of, upgraded strategic partnerships, comprehensive strategic partnerships, 2+2 meetings and what have you, both countries, I think, are ultimately still managing mediocrity. The relationship is mediocre. It's not the worst. It's not the best either. And it's certainly not the best or the worst compared to other countries in the region. So yeah, we're doing okay, I think, collectively. But ultimately, I think the energy is still very much geared towards managing mediocrity.
Hi, Evan. Thanks for that. So your response then begs the question, right? Sort of, why is it the case? Maybe you could elaborate for our listeners, right? Sort of, why do you think the bilateral relationship is caught up in what you call mediocrity, right? Sort of, despite very grandiose plans to elevate the bilateral relationship, especially Biden and then President Jokowi concluded the Comprehensive Strategic Partnership.
Well, I think from Jakarta's standpoint, the administration of President Jokowi for the last 10 years has certainly played a role in that regard. Indonesia hasn't had a proper US ambassador for almost as long. Most of the last 3 or so of Indonesian ambassadors to Washington have been part-time. They've been busy with a lot of stuff in Jakarta. In fact, the last ambassador was at the same time during the presidential campaign, was the campaign chairman of Prabowo. Indonesia hasn't had a proper kind of ambassador as well. And why that's the case? Because I think in the last administration, Jokowi simply does not consider the US to be a critical piece of his economic policy and strategy. Not to mention historical legacies around the challenges of working with the US administration. But in general, beyond the Jokowi administration, I think the trend has always been so much energy during Obama years essentially was
Mm.
geared towards having that first strategic partnership framework. At that time, things were sort of moving in different domains, technology, environment, and so forth. And so the Obama year strategic partnership framework tried to put all of them together. But rather than actually building on that strategic partnership, we had the Trump years, which sort of brings us back to the sort of more transactional aspects of the US-Indonesia relations. I remember when Mattis came as Trump's first SecDev to Jakarta, he was more interested in reinventing the wheel on some of the transactional stuff around counterterrorism, on maritime security cooperation, and sort of set aside the Obama years strategic partnership. So there's been a repeat of these things. And since the end of the Cold War, if you want to pull it even further, it's certainly the case that the value of Indonesia in Washington has ebbed and flowed. Sometimes
Mm-hmm.
it's specific aspects of counterterrorism during the war on terror. At other times now, it's about how useful is Indonesia in the effort to compete with China. It's rarely the case that Washington understands Indonesia in its own terms and tries to figure out what it needs to do. On the other hand, Indonesia itself has sort of learned to live without the United States for a while, going back to the Iraq War, going back to the first Trump administration. And so, in that sense, the political economy and the strategic bandwidth in Indonesia has shifted as well over the last 10,
Mm-hmm.
15 years or so, that the US still ranks very high. Indonesia's security interest and broader kind of economic interest is still very much tied to the US, whether it's about terrorism, whether it's EV ecosystems, and so forth and so on. But I don't think there is the same level of energy and commitment in both Washington in Jakarta to make sure that the relationship is more than managing mediocrity. Let's make sure things don't go off the rails has been
Mm.
basically the mantra, I think, over the last 5, 10 years.
That does make me wonder, though. You mentioned just now that with the return of Trump to the White House, we're looking at a return of a more transactional policy between Indonesia and the US. Do you think that's necessarily a bad thing, or do you think that's perhaps an opportunity for maybe smaller victories or smaller achievements in the relationship? And more specifically, what opportunities do you think Indonesian leaders see in the new Trump administration?
Well, here's the thing, right? I think, as a general rule, for any country, including Indonesia, to take opportunities amid chaos or crisis, or however you want to call it, requires you to have a robust strategic policymaking ecosystem with proper strategic thought process, which isn't
Mm.
always visible, I think, in parts of Jakarta in the recent years. And certainly it's harder to see that in the past few months as well. So while instinctively, I think transactional aspects of US foreign policy may be welcome. I mean, for a long time, many
Mm.
in the region, including in Indonesia, were somewhat uncomfortable with a values-based approach to American foreign policy. For example, issues around, human rights or democracy often hinder some aspects of cooperation. The return of a transactional approach may be sort of by default acceptable, but it's less about the transactional approach because, let's face it, whether we like it or not, despite the values-based framing, most of the engagement with the US has been sort of more transactional and pragmatic anyway. The issue is whether or not the crude manner in which these transactional approaches are publicly played out versus how they can be negotiated behind closed doors is perhaps where the risk and the cost of doing business with the United States will come into play.
Mm.
And this is where I think the risk assessment, I think, for countries like Indonesia would have to factor in those pronouncements. And these include domestic costs, right? For example, if Trump's positioning on Gaza or the Middle East may be harder for the Indonesian political elites to accept, then any
Mm-hmm.
public engagement with the US becomes a bit harder, for example. So, in that sense, there is certain risk and cost to doing things at the public sphere, given Trump's crude way of doing business. Because I think there's a line between transactional and coercive,
Mm.
right? If the way Trump does business with Ukraine is the way Trump does business with the rest of the region, in which there is a certain level of crude transactionalism played out publicly, I think they may not be such an easy path for countries like Indonesia to work with Trump. But my sense is instinctively, I think the Prabowo administration would be happy to do things behind closed doors anyway. So from
Mm,
that standpoint, it's not necessarily the worst thing, but whether or not the thought process and the policymaking ecosystem is ready to play those very difficult games, both in the public and private sphere, is for me still a bit of a question mark.
I see, I see. I like how you made the distinction between, a transactional approach as well as a kind of a coercive, extortionist kind of approach. And now that you mentioned Ukraine, I think it's actually high time that we talked about this too, given that it's still a very recent event. Over the weekend, we saw how leaders around the world, especially in Europe, rapidly responded to the very tense meeting between Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, President Trump, and VP Vance at the White House. What are your thoughts about this meeting? And how do you think this incident is being viewed in Asia more broadly?
I think parts of Asia would probably see this as a long time coming, as in, I think you would not be surprised to find that parts of Asia would agree with some form of an immediate ceasefire or halt to the
Mm-hmm.
offensive to get the economy going and to reduce pressure on supply chain, etc. And so, even if a ceasefire is not equivalent to a just peace, is not something that I feel many in Asia are particularly seriously thinking about it. So the nuances are
Mm,
often lost in that sense. And so I think parts of Asia would probably agree with the spirit of how to get Russia and Ukraine to the table under whichever particular format, as long as
mm-hmm.
the fighting stopped. But the other parts of Asia would also be curious to see if Europe would finally step up beyond expressing dismay and surprise and all of those positions, whether or not Europe would also step up more in terms of military aid or maybe even put boots on the ground. That's certainly something that I think
Mm-hmm.
the most recent European summit in London seems to suggest, if that's a possibility. But I think the idea that the European partners are now forced, for better or for worse, to do more and not just to say more is certainly something that's not unwelcome. I think in parts of Asia, despite their public messaging in Asia that the Euro-Atlantic and the Indo-Pacific theater is one single theater, it is ultimately a one-way street. It's not yet a two-way street, and it's certainly not the case where European partners can absolve themselves of the responsibility of responding to the aggression in Ukraine and
Mm,
rely on the United States. So in some ways, yes, it was a shocking drama in many ways, but I think policymakers are also now looking at beyond the drama, beyond the personal attacks about the suit and whatnot. What exactly are we going to move forward into? If it's
mm-hmm.
about ending the war in whatever format and terms and allow the pressures on supply chain to end, I'm not sure many in Asia can be bothered, quite frankly, to understand in more detail the need to have a nuanced, just peace long term and not just ceasefire. And so this is where I think what might be interesting as it relates to Indonesia is this narrative in parts of Jakarta that the current so-called peace plan or peace framework that the Trump administration might be pushing is similar to what Prabowo had put on the
Mm-hmm.
table during the Shangri-La Dialogue in 23. Now, of
Ah,
course, there's a whole debate about
yes,
if
that
it's the
one.
right plan, who the plan came from, and so forth. But the point is, I can see parts of the region, including in Indonesia, where they might not necessarily disagree with the method and the direction of travel of Washington pushing Ukraine to have some form of a peace deal, whatever that means.
Evan, sort of following up on that, do you see any possibility that the Prabowo administration would follow up with a plan to send Indonesian peacekeepers, if called for, to Ukraine? And also, sort of more generally, what do you think the fallout is from that White House meeting regarding US commitments or credibility to alliance commitments, and also, whether that might signal a possible pivot finally for the US towards Asia.
That's a good question. I think on peacekeeping operations, I could be wrong, but I don't remember a history where Indonesia would send a UN peacekeeping operations without a UN resolution. And so whatever it is that Indonesia could contribute in whatever form a Ukraine peacekeeping framework would look like, it would certainly not be separate from the UN, I would think. In the meantime, would Indonesia provide a tokenistic support of some kind, like aid delivery or anything like that? Sure, I can see that happening. But will Indonesia lead the way in terms of having a peacekeeping situation where it's separate from the UN mandate and all of that, and be the first one on the ground to enforce, let's say hypothetically, there is some form of a frozen demilitarized zone? I doubt that. I think it's a very difficult institutional setup if that was done separately. On the other hand, Prabowo is also trying to demonstrate he can order the military to do whatever he wants. For example, Indonesia has never sent its military cadets to play in the marching band situation overseas until he did that in India, for example, right? And so, yeah, in small scales, I can see that happening, but a UN peacekeeping operation, I don't think can happen without a UNSC mandate of any kind, and certainly not without the explicit request by both parties, which at this point, I'm not sure Ukraine would necessarily consent to Indonesia peacekeepers on its territory. So that's a whole different set of challenges that I'm not sure Jakarta has a ready-made answer on how to address them. On the meeting itself and what it means for alliances, I think that's a good question because the drama, I think, is indicative of not just the mannerism in which these things would be discussed. And if these things are discussed in such crude manner in public, I can only imagine how these things would be discussed behind closed doors. And so for many in the region, particularly in Asia or I guess in Southeast Asia, where diplomacy still includes mannerism in how you approach things, it may not be the easiest meetings for regional diplomats to negotiate or to engage in good faith conversations if the pressures and demands are pretty high up there from an objective standpoint of specific requests. But specific requests aside, what that tells me, I think that meeting tells me, is that in the altar of whatever grand bargain that the US would like to think it's doing, whether it's about a Russian deal or a China deal, the interests of the smaller powers would be secondary to what the US would like to do. If by some twist of history, for example, there is a grand bargain to be made with China over the South China Sea at the expense of the claimant states in Southeast Asia, would the US prioritize the Southeast Asian states' position on these issues? I'm not convinced, because we are going back to that era where Russia and China are the top two big great power challenges that Washington needs to deal with, and everything else comes secondary. So it's the subsuming of small powers' interests and concerns within the broader great power bargains is perhaps the more concerning aspect. And so right now, I think everyone is trying to get Washington's attention to make sure that their interests are not sacrificed at the altar of great power engagements.
Yes, I think that's quite right. When Adrian and I were in DC recently, I think one of the big takeaways was that it's really important for Southeast Asian leaders to get an audience with Trump at the White House or at Mar-a-Lago, depending on where he is. And there was a bit of a missed opportunity for Prabowo when he was in the US right after the election, that he couldn't meet with Trump at Mar-a-Lago. Talking about, US engagement in the region and US allies as well does lead us to another question though. What do you think about AUKUS? Now, after AUKUS was announced, Prabowo was, at the time, defense minister. He was quite sanguine about it. He said, he understands, respects the reasons behind why the defense arrangement was created. Now that he is in power, how do you think his government will choose to address the issue?
Before we get to AUKUS, I just want to say that I think for Southeast Asia, including Indonesia, there's a bit of a catch-22. maybe it's not the worst thing that Trump doesn't know where Southeast Asian countries are. Because if he does turn his attention towards Southeast Asia and he starts to nitpick on trade deficits and all the things that we may or may not be doing to support American interests, may not be the best choice as well. So it's not attention seeking per se, but it's the right controlled attention on some issues and not others, which is an even harder task without a strong presence in DC, I think, including for Indonesia, which hasn't, as I mentioned, hasn't had a proper ambassador for a while now. And this relates to the point about AUKUS as well. I think AUKUS for Indonesia has to be seen in a few different tones. The first tone is about the manner in which it was announced, which explains some of the initial, shall we say, less than happy responses, which explains some of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs' push to make this about nuclear non-proliferation, but one cannot ignore the personal offense taken by many in Jakarta about the manner it was announced, especially given the history of Indonesia-Australia relations in which surprises are not supposed to happen anymore. So that's, I think, the tone that continues to color some of Indonesia's responses, not all of them. But that's one that we cannot ignore. The second tone is from the perspective of regional tension in general. Despite the sort of more potentially, flexible approach to AUKUS, whatever that means, I think the notion that AUKUS can contribute to regional tension is still going to be there. I've heard, for example, AUKUS being discussed in the same breath as FPDA and the Quad when it comes to defense establishment's concerns about the encirclement of Indonesia by unilateral security arrangements that don't include it. One should not underestimate the public expressions of concern just because in private you have assurances that Indonesia is not against AUKUS. I think people often conflate those two and say, hey, it's fine. As long as in private they say they love AUKUS, we'll be fine. I don't think that's the right way of approaching Indonesia's response. I think the expressions of concern is genuinely there when it comes to regional tensions in general. Now, of course, there is perhaps a much more deeper debate about whether or not AUKUS is ultimately a deterrent, stabilizing, provoking. It's all in the eye of the beholder, and there is no right answer to that question, I think. But the point is the perception of Indonesia isn't just about the AUKUS component per se, but it's also about the regional environment and tension that Indonesia needs to operate moving forward. I think the third tone when it comes to Prabowo himself, I think there is a limit to which you can overestimate Prabowo's statement because oftentimes he is running based on what I would consider as a mood and momentum platform. It's all about instincts, and sometimes the policy framework follows that instinct, sometimes it doesn't. But so far, as you pointed out, there is no explicit rejections of AUKUS in that sense, because ultimately, going back to the second tone about tension, the presence of regional tension also provides a public rationale for the Prabowo administration, both currently as well as before when he was defense minister, to push for those pre-existing procurement plans. And so it is useful in that sense. It may not be a genuine driver for Indonesia's military procurement plans or modernization, but it is a useful pretext and public rationale to push those plans. And so in that sense, I'm not surprised there is a more understanding aspect of Prabowo's positions on AUKUS, but I also don't think it means that Indonesia will join AUKUS anytime soon. Not that we have anything to offer in that sense for Pillar 2, but the point being is that the underlying concern over regional tension and deteriorating regional security environment, I think will always be there regardless of the mood and momentum that Prabowo often speaks from.
Evan, you mentioned procurement plans with regard to AUKUS, but we've also seen President Prabowo engage in a lot of defense deals with France and Turkey and acquiring defense material. And one of the things that I was wondering if you could comment on was moving forward with the Trump administration, do you see defense cooperation, defense deals as part of improving bilateral relations with the US, whereby the administration offers to buy more defense equipment from the US?
That's two separate questions. One in terms of defense deals within the bilateral relationship and defense deals in general with regards to Indonesia's military capabilities. I think on the second one, sure, I think certainly F-15 discussions have been framed within that broader bilateral relationship. But whether or not it's actually good for Indonesia's overall effectiveness and readiness, I think is a separate question, because Indonesia is already the most highly diversified source of partnerships when it comes to its weaponry. I think it's about 33, 34 countries. And so Indonesia is also suffering from its own problems of interoperability, maintenance, repair, and so forth and so on. So the solution to Indonesia's defense capabilities, at least at the regional level, is definitely not just buying kit. Buying kit is one thing, but it's certainly not the only thing. And I'm not sure with US companies, the prospect of offsets is as straightforward as compared to European defense deals, for example. So the price of buying American tends to be more expensive, but one can also make the argument you're not buying the kit, you're buying the relationship, you're buying the engagement. Sure, I think that's certainly there. The question is whether or not we have the money to pay for all of those things is a separate issue. And whether or not, as US-China competition grows more intense, if Indonesia were to maintain its old ways of doing hedging, okay, fine, we buy F-15s, but I also want to buy Chinese frigates and submarines. Is that going to create problems down the line? That hasn't been really worked out, I think. I think right now, the defense establishment under Prabowo is playing by instinct, which is to maintain good relationship and to be able to say we're maintaining a posture of independent and active foreign policy, we'd like to buy from everyone. That sounds good normatively, but in practice, it's very counterproductive for defense capabilities in general, and it's certainly not something sustainable if the US and China competition were to grow. I think another test would probably happen before that, which is this recent discussion in Jakarta about potentially reactivating the older contracts with Russia, which was kind of quiet down when Defense Minister Prabowo took office with the premise that a US-Indonesia defense relationship would grow, that Washington will invite Defense Minister Prabowo to the Pentagon in the early 2020 and therefore avoid CAATSA sanctions. But if Indonesia were to reactivate some of those old contracts with Russia, will there be a rediscussion of CAATSA sanctions as well? I mean, given that things seem to be improving between US and Russia for a whole different set of reasons, that may not be the case. So that's why maybe there is this discussion to reactivate those old Russian contracts because things have changed in Washington with regards to Russia. So there's a lot of things up in the air beyond US procurement alone, as it also deals with China, right? China-Indonesia defense relationship is the weakest of the bilateral relationship, and it's the one focus that was supposed to be different now moving forward. And so there's a lot of this stance that I'm not sure Indonesia has the strategic reflex and thought process to be able to follow through and make it sustainable.
Talking about arms though, I suppose that does apply to the proposal that Indonesia kind of expressed back in 2020 to acquire some F-35 Joint Strike Fighters. Do you think that was more in terms of, say, trying to show their interest in engaging the US, or was that a serious deal, considering that there were, like you said, there are budgetary restrictions?
Like I said, when it comes to Indonesia's strategic choices under Prabowo, first rule is not to assume there is a strategic thought process.
Yes.
Which is the same when it comes to defense procurement. Sure, we can rationalize it as external observers about, what signals it's trying to send, how serious it is, does Indonesia even have the money? But now that we've settled on some form of advanced negotiations around F-15s, I don't think F-35 is certainly in the books. And that's something certainly that Singapore would have a thing or two to say about Indonesia's a possible F-35 engagement. But I think that part is sort of settled. But again, you kind of have to locate those types of procurement proposals within the broader framework of Indonesia's defense procurement in general. And my sense is there's a lot of instinct and there's a lot of impulses about what to buy, but I don't think the policy ecosystem is necessarily there, from the financing for it all the way down to the actual operationalization and maintenance or sustainment of those assets. And the Air Force in particular is already struggling with the possibility of operating a fifth type of fighter aircrafts if the Rafales from the French will be coming in the next few years. And so the Indonesian Air Force simply doesn't have the capacity to have a sixth or even a potential seventh types of frontline fighters right now. So I feel like it's useful, perhaps within the context of the bilateral relationship with Washington, to say, let's keep building on this relationship, and also let me buy some stuff from you. Sure. But the follow through, I think, is a whole different ball game. And so this is where I think the true test of Indonesia US defense relationship, again, going back to my earlier point, are they still going to be managing mediocrity, and whether or not the policy framework from both sides is ready to actually engage in meaningful working level engagement beyond the highest level meetings and on the spot type of overtures.
I see. Yeah, that's a good point, whether they can move away from this approach of managing, mediocrity. That said, though, what do you expect to see in the US-Indonesia relationship then over, say, the next year or two? And what kind of low-hanging fruit are there, if any?
There are discussions about how Indonesia and US can restart the conversation on the critical minerals agreement. I think the ecosystem of EVs and nickels and all of that is still high on the agenda in Jakarta. Whether or not recent developments in Indonesia with regards to its sovereign wealth fund, with regards to its EV ecosystems and all of those things, will that be sort of rejigged as the country moves forward? And if that opens the opportunities to restart the talk on the critical minerals agreement, I think is still something to be seen. But I think that type of issues will still be on the table. You'll see perhaps visits. I think for Indonesia under Prabowo, there is no engagement that doesn't start with a personal visit of some kind. So I expect some form of a visit this year in terms of actually meeting Trump. I'm not sure how, I'm not sure why, and in what platform, but I don't think that's out of a question that it needs a personal visit. And of course, who the ambassador to be appointed to Washington would be kind of the secondary question, because that will determine which policy frameworks are available to push the needle further. Some low-hanging fruit is usually around military exercises, a variation of doing more stuff on Super Garuda Shield, maybe location, maybe types of exercises like cyber, maybe space. But there's room to work around those exercises because it sounds big and symbolic. It doesn't require a lot of resources, but it's somehow significant. And of course, the F-15 procurement is certainly high on that list of defense cooperation. Issues around ASEAN is probably the least interesting bits of it. But of course, we'll see what happens at Shangri-La. We'll see the customary US-ASEAN meeting on the sidelines of Shangri-La, which would be interesting for Secretary Hegseth as well to run the first time. But we'll see. I feel like most of that conversation on the South China Sea, on Myanmar and other regional security issues might come sooner at ADMM or not, depending on the schedule. But Indonesia, I'm not sure. There will be questions, I think, around USAID because there's a lot of programs affected by the recent cuts to USAID programs in Indonesia, which I think the Jakarta side would raise. Whether or not they would play it safe and come back to the comprehensive strategic partnership framework to work on some of those issues, I think would be easier. But yeah, I think issues around IPAF, issues around nickel and economic engagements and investment, I think will still always be there. But whether or not Indonesia will have a different set of tools to play with and to offer with the United States under Trump administration is something that I think remains a question mark. But my sense is the structural nature of the mediocre relationship isn't going to fundamentally change just yet.
Yes, Evan, sort of picking up on your last comment, so far we have not discussed the T word, tariffs, which Trump administration has already said that it intends to impose reciprocal tariffs. And speaking of the Prabowo administration's toolkits, how do you think the administration is going to deal with the issue of tariffs?
See, that's an interesting question because a part of the concern about tariffs has been what has been dubbed, I guess, sort of China washing, right? So China relocates its production facilities to Indonesia and then it goes into the US or European markets under a made in Indonesia or a made in Southeast Asia label as opposed to made in China label. And that has raised the prospects beyond the trade deficit stuff that this can also be part of the tariffs problem down the line, that Washington will caught on in terms of the supply chain and then have more tariffs down the line. So certainly those things are part of the conversation in Jakarta, but I'm also not convinced right now the bandwidth of the policy community in Jakarta is directed towards that. Right now, there's so many issues around budget efficiency and domestic spending that is a much higher priority than tariffs right now. Sure, there's a small circle in Indonesia that would sort of, hey, we should also be thinking about this. But right now, it's about budget cut. It's massive, and it's a much order in magnitude compared to the concerns over tariffs. If this leads to domestic instability over food, over education, over labor, over public servants, again, Indonesia has a limited bandwidth to begin with in terms of international economic policy. This makes it even lower down the food chain, so to speak. So I think there are some concerns. Certainly, it's being discussed. I know the National Economic Council have discussed this issue, but again, 8 out of 10 of the policy questions right now is domestic spending and the implications of budget cuts. So until probably after the new budget is officiated in the next few months, until things are clear in terms of which agency gets whatever budget cuts, then maybe Indonesia can finally address the issues of tariffs. So right now, as long as Indonesia's kind of fiscal space or market or trade is not immediately affected right now by Trump's tariffs to a significant degree, they're just going to push back the discussion until if and when they have to deal with it. Because right now, I feel like the bandwidth is very much domestic budget issues and not international tariffs yet. So it's not clear, I think, how Jakarta would respond.
That's certainly true. And I think Indonesia can at least take heart that, they're not anywhere near the top of Trump's tariff hit list in Southeast Asia, because at the top would be Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia. And that's one of the benefits, I suppose, of the current state of the kind of mediocre relationship on one hand. That being said, though, I mean, beyond, the economic side of things, do you see any other challenges in the relationship over the next year or two? Just a general lack of bandwidth, maybe?
I mean, that's always a given, the lack of bandwidth. But I wonder if issues around Ukraine and Gaza will become part of the conversation, at least in Jakarta. There is, on the one hand, Indonesia's ongoing application to OECD, which would necessitate some form of recognition of Israel, which is its own domestic political time bomb. But on the other hand, Indonesia has also staked its international position on Gaza in strong terms. So if, for example, the idea of Trump to depopulate Gaza, have resorts and whatnot, would that create more challenges for the Indonesian administration to work with the US administration on a wide range of other issues? In other words, will Gaza be a litmus test in Jakarta in one way or the other? So that, I think, is perhaps something that it's kind of hard to predict because, again, some of Indonesia's own plans would require some form of engagement with Israel on OECD stuff. On the other hand, again, the positioning, and in fact, throughout the campaign and Prabowo's own initial public statements and writings on the issue when he was still president-elect and after is very much centered around two-state solution, right? If the steps that the Trump administration is taking is against a two-state solution in practice, would that make it harder for Indonesia to work with the United States on other issues? I don't know. But I do think, unlike, before October 7th, I think certainly the issue is much more prominent now than before. So I wonder if that issue will also color the engagement for the next 2 years. And if there's a meeting between Trump and Prabowo, how explicit and how robust will the conversation be on Gaza? Is it going to be performative, as in, fine, we'll talk about it, but let's do other things? Or is it going to be front and center and sets the tone for everything else? Because that's how I felt when Jokowi last visited Washington before he stepped down in 23, I think, in which it was front and center, especially after he just came back from OIC. So that, for me, I think will be an interesting variable to look out for in the next 1 year or so.
I see. Yeah, let's hope that the meeting goes better than the one that just happened in the White House. Beyond that, do you have any last thoughts or, insights that you'd like to leave the audience with?
I think an interesting long-term question, which I don't think has an answer yet, but Indonesia has always been suspicious of all great powers, whether it's US, whether it's Russia, Soviet, what have you. And there is no one great power that has the absolute moral, strategic, or political high ground than the other. The question is whether or not, I think, if Indonesia has reached the point that the Trump administration is not a blip, that the policies of whatever version of coercive transactionalism and retrenchment and making great power deals is here to stay, what does it say about Indonesia's strategic partners moving forward? Can Indonesia afford to ignore the US for a long time? Is Indonesia going to do the opposite and engage the US even further? But I feel like there is a deeper, longer question about the viability of the United States as a strategic partner for Indonesia as well as within the region. And I don't think there is an easy answer yet, but it's been, I think, certainly trending downwards in terms of what can be considered as America's staying power. Going back to the Iraq War, it's not new suddenly that this is an issue, right? It's been an issue for the last 2 decades now. But have we reached a culminating point of no return in which, yes, we've accepted that the US is gone, and therefore, what do we do next? I think this is a question that is as urgent in Europe as it is, I think, in Southeast Asia as well.
Yes, I completely agree. It's prevalent not just in Jakarta, but throughout all the other capitals in Southeast Asia. I'm sure behind closed doors, there's a lot more conversation going about how should we position ourselves with regard to the US in the future. So thank you for that takeaway. And thank you for your time, Evan. Thank you everyone as well for tuning in. We hope you enjoyed this episode. If there are any questions or topics you'd like us to tackle in future episodes, feel free to reach out to us on social media or through email. Until next time, stay safe and we'll see you again.